Welcome back to the part 2 of psychoanalysis. Separation never happens. So far, with our subject expert, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya, we have been discussing things like what it is to have attachments, being related to things, and how separation operates in a deeper psyche beyond the world and the virtual and the internal world. So, sir, we were somewhere in a very interesting point where you were discussing how you have experienced this in particularly with your asthma.
Yes, in the last 12 years, ever since I started measuring on the PFM peak flow meter readings, I have never crossed 250. And a few days back, for the first time, I had 340. And
This is very high.
Yeah, it continued above 300 for quite some time, for quite 2 to 3 days.
Oh.
Now, again, after that, it came back. But during that time, one of the factors which was at work was my encounter with my own attachment and related emotions. And this came across with a cat, so very surprisingly, that there was a cat who used to come for quite some time, and there was an unconscious attachment which built up, which I never knew. And now we were trying to shoo it away because we could not manage it anymore. And that was creating both sadness and guilt. And what was important for me is to recognize that the same thing would have happened unconsciously before, perhaps multiplied 5 to 10 times over.
Oh.
But this gives me a sample of what would have happened then, because this time it is conscious. And what I felt was there was a deep, very deep-seated sadness at breaking of the attachment, a deep-seated guilt. And the guilt leads to signal anxiety, and this is underplayed. Sadness and anger we accept, but guilt is usually underplayed. So often guilt is at work for various reasons. It may be because of anger we have towards the person who is separating, and that leads to guilt and that leads to anxiety. Or it may be because we are moving away from the person and have some guilt. Or maybe our incapability, because of which the relationship broke down, and this guilt about not being capable enough. So this is underplayed. And if the normal reaction to this is that it is completely unconscious, and if it becomes slightly conscious, we move away from that place. So if a lot of sadness, anger, guilt, and anxiety is being generated at home, some people would fall sick and move to the hospital. Some people would go to the relative's place. Some people would go out on a vacation. Or some people would have a full-blown explosion of a fight. But there would be something. And one of the most common things to do is to move away from that place under some pretext or the other. The sight of the other person to whom attachment is, that triggers these difficult emotions. So the normal move is to move away from that person or that place, the object of attachment. But if we don't do that, we remain there and we bravely face the feelings, then we move from one stage to another. And eventually, initially, the first tendency is to move away, and we may have to move away initially 2 or 3 times because it's too difficult. But slowly we develop capacity with practice, with thinking, with deeper, profound understanding of the necessity to develop the capacity. And with that, slowly we'll develop capacity, and then it becomes like a process that you don't resist, you don't feel sadness at sadness, you don't have the secondary emotion, and you are not fighting the emotion. And with that, over a period of time, we see the emotion loses much of its sting, much of its intense color and flavor. And this becomes more like a perturbation of some psychic process, what U.G. Krishnamurti calls as a fluctuation, right? Some psychic fluctuation. And usually, if you give pain to the body, the natural instinct for the body is to move away from it. The body recoils. Like even if somebody is asleep and you put, let us say, a cigarette, the person will recoil. It's a natural impulse of the body. So the same way the mind recoils from difficult emotions. But over a period of time, the mind develops capacity and detachment. And with that, that emotional movement now is only a process movement, a fluctuation. And one experiences it only as an intense movement, not as sadness as one used to experience before. Now, this is not a everyday experience. This is a rare experience. But it's,
So when you say mind recoils, does that mean that my mind regresses?
mind tries to avoid. First is to shift attention, and then to define. If shifting of attention is not enough and it keeps coming up, then it is to use the defensive operations. And most of the defensive operations involve creating some sort of signal anxiety. And so then you are just with pain without feeling the identification with it, without feeling the intensity of it. You only feel it as an intense, almost a neutral kind of process, without any aversion or attachment. And now the pain has turned into a special kind of a synthium, as Lacan would describe it, a special synthium. It is felt intensely in the chest area, in the center of the chest, in the heart chakra, to use our Hindu psychology terminology. And this over a period of time, then the perturbation settles down. And we are then neutral to that perturbation, even if it comes up again. That capacity is developed, that terror and the aversion to pain goes away, at least in that particular context. May not be universal, but at least to that context. That, I think, is the beginning of slowly generalizing it to the universal. So this is one part of it. Now, the only thing I will repeat is this, that guilt is underplayed and is very, very intense in the way it manifests in this separation process.
Just a digression. What about guilt? Can you elaborate more on it?
Let us go back to
because when you talk about this guilt part, there is also that a person doubts the worthiness of self, that there is separation because I am not deserving enough. So is there to do the superego getting involved into it, the moral factor, which is bringing in the combination of guilt along with anger and pain, what it is about?
Yeah. So Freud talked about guilt he talked about superego. And in his view, the superego had two parts, thou shall and thou shall not. So two prescriptions come out of superego, thou shall and thou shall not. And under both of these headings, there is a list of things. Thou shall, A, B, C, D, E, thou shall not, A, B, C, D, E. So there are two things, the ideals and the taboos. Thou shall is the list of ideals. Thou shall not is the list of taboos. And what happens in Freudian conceptualization is, thou shall not is a taboo and it is guilt. If you do something, it attacks you. So anything in the area of thou shall not happens, your guilt is activated and it attacks you. it punishes you, and a part of you agrees with that guilt, that yes, I deserve the punishment. So this is one part. The second part is Freud talked about the ideal, thou shall. And in Freudian conceptualization, what happens is thou shall is taken up by the ego, and the ego modifies a part of itself to create the ego ideal. So thou shall is not so much operationally situated in the superego in the Freudian conceptualization, as much as it's become the part of the ego by creating ego ideal by modification of the part of the ego. But I conceptualize it slightly differently. I conceptualize that part of superego in two components. One is the superego ideal, and second is that superego ideal which has been taken up by the ego to modify itself and create the ego ideal. The ego ideal is more practical, which is, let me put it this way, is less surreal. It is still difficult to achieve. It may still be an aspirational thing. It may still be only a guiding lighthouse which one can never touch. But still, compared to that superego,
some kind of sublimation of some effect generated, the ideal ego.
This is more like a collapse into reality.
Okay.
We had one discussion before titled Collapse into Reality. That how the mind can conceptualize things which are completely surreal as its goals. So the mind can conceptualize at the highest the absolute, below the absolute the omnipotent, below the omnipotent the superego ideal, and below it the ego ideal. So each is lowering down from those stratospheric heights down towards the more practical reality. So the ego ideal in that sense is slightly more practical, slightly less surreal than the superego ideal. And there are two parts of it. One is the guilt part of it, that the guilt may arise out of a variety of factors. One is doing something which is morally unacceptable, giving somebody pain, and being sadistic, being selfish. Now, these are obvious transgressions of the superego. I mean, these moral transgressions anybody can make out. But there are some more parts of guilt where one feels that some part of oneself is dirty, filthy, disgusting. That also is one manifestation where the guilt renders certain parts of the psychic contents as guilty, as dirty or filthy or disgusting. So these are parts of oneself that we ourselves find to be dirty, filthy, and disgusting, often coming up in dreams symbolized by rats or by very slimy snakes or slimy worms, creatures. So this may very well be the filthy, slimy, disgusting parts of oneself, which have been so evaluated by our own morality. Nobody has told us. Often nobody even knows about it. But there are certain things which have happened in the internal world or in action in the outer world, which later on the mind itself finds to be dirty, disgusting, or filthy. And then this content is repressed and symbolized in the dreams in one way. Now, the second part of the superego has to do with what is less known. Yeah, sorry. Now, one more part of guilt. One more part of guilt has to do with one's competence. That often not being competent enough, not being good enough, leads to a peculiar kind of guilt. which is different from the guilt of not working hard. This is the guilt of not being competent enough, where the working hard may just be a component of it. And this is also a guilt. The second part of it is the positive part of superego, which relates, which is not talked about, the ecstasy, the confidence, the exhilaration, the energy, the creativity, the productivity, the happiness, which comes by aligning with one's superego. And this is a component of happiness which most of us have forgotten to tap into. One of the things that the present day culture does is to laugh at the superego. And because the culture laughs at the superego, at least in public, if not in private, and in many cases in private also, we have forgotten the happiness, the power, the productivity, the creativity, all the good things which flow from the superego. So we have seen only the punitive part of the superego. We have not seen the abundant, bountiful, plenitude part of superego, which we have not tapped into it, and logotherapy taps into it. Positive psychology taps into it. The abundance and the plenitude in terms of happiness, power, and courage, which is bestowed upon us by the superego when we are in alignment with the superego. A different sort of courage, a different sort of energy, positivity comes up. A different happiness comes up when we are in tune with our ideal self. And we have not tapped it. We are busy tapping the instinctual sensual pleasures, but we have not tapped into the superego pleasure, which is far more bountiful and free of cost in a way. Most of the time free of cost, let us say. So this is one part of it. Now, in separation, if the ego is handled well, then instead of the harsh ego punishing us, we actually get the happiness of the superego, that bountiful part of the superego, because we consciously know that we are doing the separation well, as best as it can be done, as selflessly as it can be done, as less painfully to the other as it can be done. So the more conscious we become, even while there is a bite of guilt, the bite reduces substantially, and the bountifulness of the positive part of the superego starts flowing in, showering in, if we handle guilt well in the separation process. It's a very important part, often underlooked in managing separation.
So again, talking about separation, so it never really happens, or it does.
In most of the cases, let's say, if we talk of the rule and the exception, the rule is it never happens. It happens only in exceptions. So what happens is, as Freud said, part of the affect is repressed, part of it is somatized, part of it modifies the ego, part of it is thrown outside, part of it is displaced onto objects or non-human entities or other objects, part of it creates symptoms, part of it comes up in dreams, and the sadness, anger, and guilt, they remain repressed and play mischief by and large from the unconscious. Now, to have the object completely detoned of its effect and to have a perfect mourning and to really convert a reminiscence into a remembrance, these are ideals. These are not achieved most of the times. So the rule is it never happens. And when we say it never happens, then we are talking of a full continuum. Within it never happens. That you may have mild, moderate, and severe. Within it never happens. that a separation has not happened fully, but what it has left behind is something mild, or it has left behind something moderate or severe. Now, the severe can create extremely difficult pathology. Very simple example would be fetishes. That some object cannot be given up and you hold on to a fetish instead of that object. Or somebody not able to give the transitional object of childhood. He is not able to give it up even in the adult stage. Some people just don't want to move out of the city, can't give up the attachments to the city. Some just can't move away even from an abusive attachment. And the worst would be psychosis, where one is completely fused with objects which are no longer alive and one is just not able to separate. A good movie on this was made by Hitchcock. It was a trilogy, 3 movies, Alfred Hitchcock, 3 movies, Psycho 1, Psycho 2, Psycho 3, in which the person keeps the dead body of the mother hidden in one of the rooms and keeps talking to her as though she was alive, because there is no way he can process that sadness and separation. He is so fused and he does not have any other relationships. The only relationship probably he had was the mother, and mother passed away, and there was only one way of dealing with the loss, and that is to deny it by keeping the body, preserving the body, and talking to the body in a psychotic way. So the person regresses to partly to his infantile state, but partly he's still very clever in the outside world, but a part of him regresses. And that part of him goes into that magical thinking of preserving the mother's body, which he just can't let it go. So, in one sense, if we look at all of us, we all have some memories which well up inside and water up our eyes when we go to some schools, meet our friends, or think about them. So, some separations, some traumas, and when we get into deeper psychoanalysis, let's say a 3 day a week, 3 day a week, or 5 day a week, and it goes on for some years, then those upper layers give way to those deeply buried things to come up and present themselves before our eyes, bright and clear. And there we realize that what we thought was over has not been over and possibly is never going to be over. So, as a rule, unless one has gone very deep into oneself for years and years, in most individuals, most of the separations never happen. They just remain buried, defended, creating the core of melancholy, modifying the ego, coming up in dreams. But they remain as difficult friends inside of us till death.
So it brings us to the applied part of it. What can be done about it? If it has to be dealt in a healthy way, if at all, or it should not be.
Having the capacity to process it is always welcome. The ideal of being capable of going through a separation successfully is always welcome. So we have to accept the ideal and build our capacity and move towards it as much as possible. And in that, psychotherapy helps, ISTDP helps, the chakra cleaning helps, deep-seated catharsis that happens in workshops, that helps. Some forms of active meditation which are deeply cathartic, they help. Going back to those places where the separation has not happened, that helps. And it's always good to go back to our places of childhood. It's a very deep-seated closure. It is something which has to be experienced to really feel it. So when we look at the ways to do it, what we find is psychoanalysis is there, but I would say psychoanalysis to bring up those memories, small fragments of it, and do a horizontal excavation, and then take up each of those items in a more cathartic technique like ISTDP or a workshop or some active meditation, or maybe do only a focused cathartic psychoanalysis. Or if one is interested, one can go into the chakra cleaning, or one can go into something like Vipassana, or one can go into something like Tantra, where one lives out, it's living beyond reflecting. Quite a distinct approach than psychoanalysis, which is based upon reflecting, not acting. So these are some of the broad approaches, each of which, of course, has many details and has to be done only with a certified authorized professional. But these are some of the approaches which we can take to work out as many separations thoroughly, completely as we can.
In the beginning of the session itself, we were discussing the pathological version of the ego state and that of the desired ideal ego state, and you pointed towards the Hindu spirituality. So how does Hindu spirituality look at it as a complete context of attachment, relativity, and separation?
In fact, Hindu spirituality has two concepts at its very center. At its very center in Hindu spirituality, there are about 10 to 15 core concepts. Say, the concept of karma, the concept of reincarnation, the concept of enlightenment. These are some of the central concepts of Hindu spirituality. One of the, if you look at 10 to 15 core central concepts of Hindu spirituality, one of the central concepts is attachment and aversion, rag and dvesh. So attachment and aversion is at the root of the operational part of psychology as it operates in everyday life. So Hindu spirituality clearly recognizes that we are essentially unconditionally attaching creatures. And therefore attachments bind us, and similarly aversion also binds us. Often attachment can use aversion as its tool, either to secretly maintain an attachment or to have a separate kind of an attachment. So desire leads to pleasure, leads to attachment and aversion, leads to satisfaction, dissatisfaction. In fact, you can also say desire leads to pleasure or displeasure, leads to attachment, aversion, and simultaneously it leads to satisfaction on one hand and anger, sadness, and anxiety on the other, on the side of dissatisfaction. So this is at the very root of the psyche. So Hindu spirituality recognizes this, and it gets into two broad approaches to it. One is to be away from attachments as far as possible and keep working on the root desires which are leading to attachments, and take a break from the environment in which attachments are happening automatically. So that is the road of sannyas, where one creates a distance between oneself and the everyday world where attachments happen, and one isolates oneself, right, and works on whatever attachments have been created till now and does not create any new ones. So you give up whatever has happened, don't create new ones, go to the root, and once you are strong enough, come back to the world in an enlightened way to have enlightened attachments where you do service to others. And then in the course of it, if attachments form, you keep working on it. This is one way. The second way is the way of Tantra, which is to immerse yourself completely into attachments with consciousness and try to free yourself in the middle of all attachments. It is like maintaining a room at 25 degrees in the Arctic and Antarctica. You are trying to create a personal space contrary to all that the rest of the world is trying to impose upon you. And going to the Himalayas in the Sannyas Marga is like maintaining a room at 25 degrees in the Himalayas, which is not difficult. So it all depends upon the individual, his choice, his destiny, and also his capability and his inclination. So this is one part. The second part is the techniques which are used to overcome attachment. One is the philosophy. Once we realize the philosophy of the temporality and the philosophy of reincarnation, it becomes much easier, especially after theory of karma. And then you have techniques like energy healing, pranic healing, Reiki. You have chakra cleaning, the entire tantric system. Chakra cleaning. Yes. We have this whole meditation, pranayam, idol therapy, the whole area of mantra purification. So all these techniques of holistic healing are in that Hindu spiritual area, which are used to heal desire, attachment, aversion, separation at their very roots, so that one becomes free from it and gets into a stage of object freedom, the state of enlightenment, where one goes beyond object relations as a compulsion. He may choose object relations, but not as a compulsion. So one gets from object relations, one goes into the next stage of object freedom, the stage of enlightenment.
Deeply moving discussion it has been for me, and hope you all had the same feelings. See you again. Namaste.
Namaste.